Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to officially welcome you to the CISPE Cloud Summit. It's a very exciting day. We have lots of interesting topics, insight, and news to share with you. And to get the day started, I'd like to really first announce our first speakers, our keynotes. Starting with the representative of the Spanish government and incoming Spanish presidency, Mr. Salvador Esteban Martinez, who we will see on the video here, who is the Director General for Digitalization and Artificial Intelligence of the Spanish government. He has recorded a small welcoming message that we will play. And then this keynote will be followed by our dear friend Pearse, who is director at DigiConnect, European Commission for Future Network. We have worked with Pearse on cloud issues for as long as I remember working on cloud issues. So that must be 2016 or something like that, starting on GDPR, SLA. So I'm really glad to have you back and to see that you've continued to follow these topics. And then, on behalf of CISPE, Cindy Chabal, who is head of communication for one of our members, Outscale, 3D Outscale, a French-based company, and a subsidiary of Dassault, will give us a little introduction before the first panel starts. So without further ado, I'll ask that we run the message from Mr. Esteban Martinez, which thank you.
To the Cloud Summit 2023. I'm Salvador Esteban. I'm Director General for Digitalization and AI, and it's my pleasure to open this meeting in representation of the Secretary of State, Carme Artigas. You all might know that this year is particularly important for Spain since we are going to lead the EU presidency. Let me say that we welcome the initiatives fostered by the cloud infrastructure service providers in Europe, and we celebrate the upcoming events such as the European Cloud Summit in November under the Gaia-X leadership, which will trace the path for the near present of digitalization. We all know that cloud solutions and infrastructure play a essential role to underpin European strategic autonomy and for the dual green and digital transition. They also represent a unique opportunity for the business fabric in our countries, and especially in terms of competitiveness and innovation capacity. The cloud sector also faces opportunities and risks, which must be tackled with a holistic point of view in order to reach and maximize the chances given by digitalization. In this context, we must also look into key topics around regulation, procedures, gender inclusion, how to gain certainty, and the need to create new robust and quality infrastructure for flexible and secure data management. Today's agenda will approach all this and will aim to achieving solutions in areas such as sustainability or green investments by data centers and cloud infrastructure providers to be the first EU industrial sector to become climate neutral. From our perspective, prior to the crisis, our government was already working towards this digital society we all want, as detailed in the digital strategy, Digital Spain 2025, and recently updated until 2026. This plan is our roadmap to ensure that we will be able to take advantage of the digital transformation, and together with the funds from the Recovery, Transformation and Resilience Plan to accelerate the technological change we might need. In this sense, Spain has been working to drive projects with a high impact and great change capability focused on transforming the digitalization of the economy and society. That's why, in line with this European data strategy, our country has fostered its own project to position as data hub to its favorable technological conditions. The Digital Agenda Spain 2026 also includes other programs under our office responsibilities, such as National Artificial Intelligence Strategy, National Digital Skills Plan, the SME Digitalization Plan, or the Public Administration Digitalization Plan. To make this possible, we are investing in generating a domestic industry around AI, or data, or cybersecurity, quantum computing, or green algorithms as keystones of the digital revolution. We are working on a digital and structural reform in strategic sectors such as employment, tourism, justice, or health. And we are aware that all the players must have a holistic point of view to take advantage of the synergies between the digital transformation process and the necessary energy transition as complementary processes. And that's the reason of the importance of the public-private collaboration, we could say. It ensures a real impact for the economy, but also for the employment and businesses. In this order of ideas, as the private sector is the catalyst to multiply the effects on the economy, we've decided to boost unprecedented reforms and investments, strengthening the Spanish entrepreneurship ecosystem in order to increase its productivity, its capabilities, and its resilience, and thus to contribute to the job creation, competitiveness, and economic growth. How? To foster the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Spain and to ease the procedures, we have focused on more agile legal framework, but also we have focused on growing in Spain. For instance, the next tech funds will help enterprises grow in size, investment, and ambition, with a total investment of 4 billion euros and more than 650 million that have already been invested. And I will also like to add that since Spain is assuming the EU presidency, we will have much to do regarding areas such as AI, cybersecurity, cyber resilience, and other. As you may know, Spain ranks 7th in the European Commission's Digital Economy and Society Index. Our leadership in infrastructures, the deployment of 5G, digital services, cybersecurity, and also the leadership in the field of AI, thanks to the Spanish AI sandbox, will make it possible to promote important, highly sensitive, and media-friendly dossiers during the Spanish presidency, which will mark the new digital economy in the EU. In particular, some examples of these files, acts to work on are first the AI Act, Artificial Intelligence Act, which legislates high-risk uses of AI systems. Spain, as I've mentioned before, has agreed with the European Commission to become the first regulatory sandbox in the EU. It is crucial due to the involvement of our upcoming presidency, and besides, this initiative is aligned with Spain's intention to foster development and use of responsible artificial intelligence within the Spanish national AI strategies. We also have the data regulation, which establishes fair principles for data sharing, B2B, B2G, G2B, and will mark an important milestone in European data legislation. It's going to be key in the further future. Or another one, Cyber Resilience Act, a new legislative framework for placing on the market all products with digital elements, hardware and software, and ensuring that they comply with information requirements for buyers and users and essential cybersecurity requirements throughout the life cycle of the product or service. In general, data will be key on the development of initiatives across Europe. For instance, we believe Data Act should become an essential tool in boosting the data economy with a level playing field in data flows across entities, sectors, and member states. Our goal in general is to drive digital transformation with the investments and reforms of the recovery plan to achieve a fairer society. We have a lot of work ahead to ensure a sustainable digital economy, digital society capable of facing the challenges to come. It's been an honor to open this summit. I give now the floor for the keynote speech and the welcome remarks. I wish you an excellent day and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We will now proceed to our second keynote. Pearse O'Donoghue, please, you're welcome. I don't know if the microphone is a bit high for me, but maybe it's better for you. Yeah, maybe, try that. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here. It's actually a pleasure to be back with our CISPE friends, my CISPE friends, after certainly a period of physical separation. As you have continued to do quite important work. And very much as a compliment to what the Director General just presented to us, I would like just to take a snapshot of where we are today and reflect on how things have evolved and how therefore the role of CISPE has evolved, just as the role of cloud has evolved. Because last week in the European Parliament, we had the vote on the Parliament opinion on the Data Act, which is an important stage when we come now into the negotiations between the Council and the Parliament with regard to the text of that very important piece of legislation. From the perspective of today, cloud, obviously I will not even attempt to deal with everything in the Data Act, nor would you want me, but one essential element is that it does provide for a legal framework to ensure that we have switching, cloud switching, free of charge, and that happens in an orderly and speedy process for all cloud users. Furthermore, particularly for many of you in the CISPE community, for providers of infrastructure as a service, it even also requires functional equivalence. Now, of course, there are limits to that, including and particularly with regard to the services or the infrastructure which is actually under the control of the original provider, and that's a very important carve-out to make it a reasonable and proportionate measure. But nevertheless, it is essential that we do give legal effect and also create the technical conditions with industry, with providers and users for this to be the case. Obviously, for providers of software as a service, the Data Act goes further or has further requirements with regard to harmonized standards or interoperability specifications as the transfer, the porting of the user's data is not just anymore something that can be done as an ASCII dump or in any sort of binary form. It has to be logically ordered so it can be reused. These requirements are something where we continue to work with industry, and I must stress again, with users, and therefore it is essential for us that we have interlocutors on both sides who are not just used to, but actually willing to work with one another, willing to take account of the needs and constraints of providers, the needs and constraints of the users. That hasn't always been the case. Francesco referred to work that we've done in the past, 2014, by the way, not 2016. And unfortunately, from time to time, despite the fact that the Commission has consistently sought to give a priority to codes of conduct, in other words, to self-regulation, because the experts are there and also because the technology is evolving so fast. Unfortunately, despite the huge efforts made by a number of people, including some people in this room, they haven't actually paid off. They haven't reached the results that we wanted to because of the role played or the attitude of a certain small number of influential providers to that process. And that's something which we had to take account of. Back in the Free Flow of Data Act, we gave, shall we say, the industry its last chance. And now in the Data Act, the Commission, justifiably, I would say that, chose that we had to act. But let's move on from the Data Act in order to reflect, now that we will have in place this free fluid switching, we remove one of the major contributors to vendor lock-in. And we already saw from the Eurostat work that the fear of lock-in was actually preventing people from adopting cloud services. And back to basics, our key objective is to ensure rapid and extensive uptake of cloud services, innovative, advanced cloud services. We have a goal in the digital decade that should be at least 75% of enterprises. We're nowhere near that. We have a lot to do with you in order to achieve that. But as we do, we need to reflect not just on the evolution of the regulatory environment, which you might think that we would be obsessed about, but actually the evolution of cloud services. So when we were talking with you, the industry, in the past about the need for cloud switching, the importance of cloud uptake, we all had a vision of this being small businesses and individual customers, consumers. But of course, that's not the case anymore. Apart from that being a vital core business, with all of the other technologies, some of which we just heard from our Spanish colleague, with regard to artificial intelligence, with regard to edge computing, with regard to industrial IoT, or some would call it the industrial metaverse, the need for advanced cloud computing services, infrastructure, platform, software, is essential for Europe to be able to benefit fully and exploit these technologies for the productivity and competitiveness gains that it provides. So let's never lose sight of what the objective is. It is to ensure widespread availability and competition in these advanced services. Just as I hope that the industry as a service sector develops and actually moves out to the edge along with the technology so that we can have the computing capacity with low latency, with high bandwidth in order to provide the technical means for availing of these new technologies that are so important for our generation. So from the time of the free flow of data regulation, when I met some of you first, where we made sure that data could move freely around Europe, to the Data Act, where we make sure that the user can move freely around the market. And let's face it, it's not a binary choice of one operator or another. We are already in the multi-cloud era, where as business plans become more sophisticated, as business users' needs becomes more sophisticated, it is likely that they will want to choose several providers of different services. And that is why the switching and portability provisions are just so important. And it's not just all about regulation. We have, as a basis for our work now, our Digital Decade program, in which we are hoping to have, as I've said, 75% of businesses by 2030 fully using cloud. We want 10,000 edge nodes operating in Europe to ensure that we have edge computing, providing that real-time, low-latency service that so many industrial applications will require. And we need to ensure that all of this is done in a secure environment, one that is respectful of our zero carbon objectives, and I will come back to that, in order to ensure that Europe has the best cloud and data continuum that we could hope for. Another element, as I said, is the trusted element. It's the cloud cybersecurity. It was the case that we had a scenario in which security risks could actually have put at jeopardy our plans for the development of cloud as a whole. Just as you saw that we encountered what was more than a severe speed bump with regard to the rollout of 5G, when we had to look even at some of the infrastructure that was being put into networks and had to go back and rip it out in order to ensure that this advanced technology would be secure from day one. These are challenges we can't ignore. We must not make the same mistakes again. But security by design, will be a crucial element of everything that you're doing. If you just look at the Cyber Resilience Act, which is the other and the last piece of legislation that we hope to see adopted already on the table, it is to admit that the weakest link is now the worst vector of attack. the dumb sensor, which has a low unit cost, can actually become the means for a very serious attack, denial of service or other, which we've already seen crippling health services, businesses, and some other government services. So that is why, as we did with data protection, we had to say to ourselves, this is something which is going to impose a cost on the industry. But we have to accept that cost, because this is an objective that we cannot turn our backs on. And of course, it is our role in creating a level playing field to ensure that any supplier or provider that does not fully follow those rules, in other words, take that cost on board, is excluded from the market. So that those progressive providers who have embraced the need for data protection, for security, and also now for low carbon objectives, will be rewarded on this single European market for advanced cloud services. And that's something which we can only do with you, again, the experts in this field. We are at the same time trying to help member states to understand this rapidly evolving market. We will be providing guidance with regard to public procurement. And we'd particularly like to acknowledge the role that CISPE has been playing, first of all at national level, in helping governments and administrations to procure safely, but also to understand some of the process. But also the contribution that you are making to actually helping us to modernize and to have a clear and coherent strategy with regard to cloud public procurement, just as that technology continues to advance. So that guidance will be something which will be very useful, we hope, also in opening up what is a significant market for you, the providers, excuse me, which is, of course, the public sector. We are creating a marketplace, which is, of course, it's not very original, but it is one where users, particularly public sector users, will be able to identify application services and, of course, cloud products and services which do meet these European requirements. They can safely, thank you very much, they can safely make their procurement knowing that the services online have already been tested. And to bring this all together, I tried to make a dramatic effect yesterday, but it's not going to work. We are actually producing a cloud rule book, but I have to say immediately, it's not a new rule. We're not creating new proposals. What we're actually doing is we are trying to bring together a coherent but also transparent compendium of existing rules, standards, best practices, and codes of conduct which apply to cloud, which we hope will be useful to providers of cloud services, particularly the smaller providers in niche areas, but of course also the users, who can, on the basis of their own risk assessment, then identify what obligations they have or what they can expect a cloud provider to be doing in terms of their legal obligations as they seek to go onto the cloud. This will be a living document. For example, the first edition will not contain the provisions of the Data Act simply because it will not yet be in force, but we will be therefore updating this as things go on to ensure that that information is centrally located, visible, and understandable. So that is something which we hope to do to contribute to what is a legitimate criticism that has been made sometimes about the extent of regulation that has been coming at you and users in recent times. We're also working with the cloud industry as a whole for the future, as you would expect. We have the Cloud Alliance for Data Edge and Cloud, which is bringing together European providers with a view to developing the technical vision and putting in place what is required for Europe to be competitive, to be in the lead, to have sovereignty, without in any way closing Europe as a market. We do not want that. It would be suicidal to do so. But it is rather creating the environment where, in a situation where, because of competitive strength, because of market evolution, European companies have found it very hard to compete with the three large hyperscalers who themselves have, of course, invested hugely in developing their technologies, but now benefit from that situation to the exclusion of others. And I can't finish without mentioning what I said at the start, which is the European Green Deal, but let's put it in concrete terms. It is ensuring not just energy efficiency, but improved energy efficiency of all stages, all links in the value chain, if you like, of the cloud compute environment. And that includes now, of course, also telecommunications and the access network, where not only can it be sufficient to maintain power consumption at current levels, it actually has to be driven down, just as the volume of data is increasing exponentially. That is a huge challenge. We have to work on this together. There are technological challenges, but also, again, there are market challenges which we must recognize. We must facilitate the best in class to actually gain an advantage from the work, from the efforts that they are prepared to undertake. We already have a code of conduct drawn up with industry, but with independent arbitration through our Joint Research Centre for data centres. And the Commission last October committed to doing exactly the same for communications and access networks, in other words, the telcos, to ensure that as they become more active in the cloud market, they too are subject to exactly the same rules, but also that telecommunications and compute and cloud together in this massive continuum at all points in the value chain are working to the best standards possible with regard to energy efficiency, to driving down the carbon footprint of this industry. So I'll stop there. I could go on. There's a lot happening. I know that you were involved. We want to maintain this dialogue because the regulatory landscape has become more complex, and that's our fault. We recognize that. I hope I've explained partly the reasons, the thinking behind it. We now have to ensure that that is implemented clearly, cleverly, and fairly, and we can only do that with you, the industry, working on the implementing measures, working on the expert groups, particularly with regard to switching, in order to ensure that it actually works, it achieves its purpose. And of course, we will need to regularly self-check to make sure that it is not having any unwarranted impacts, for example, in preventing companies from entering the market or driving down the rollout of cloud. So that is something where you will continue to have a role as an industry federation, independent of us, critical, but hopefully in a positive sense, so that we get this right, because the vision for the data-driven economy in Europe is one that we all share, but it is essential for our future. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Pearse. It was very insightful to hear you. I think we should invite you more often. Thank you again for this. And I didn't know it was 2014. Time flies, really. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Cindy Chabal from Outscale to give a word of introduction on behalf of the CISPE members. And please join me on stage. And the microphone is yours. I think ça va aller?
Perfect, yeah.
Merci.
Yeah, you are taller. Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, I'm delighted to be with you today at this CISPE Summit. We are gathered today to discuss the future of cloud infrastructure in Europe. All of us here are aware that cloud infrastructure is a key element of European digital economy and plays an important role in the digital transformation of public and private organizations. It is therefore essential that we address the critical challenges facing the sector and find the appropriate measures to unlock Europe's potential for cloud innovation. So thank you for talking about that. I would like to reiterate that Europe is guided by strong values when it comes to protecting citizens' privacy and data. This is why I strongly support standouts such as the CISPE Code of Conduct for cloud service providers, which provides a clear compliance framework and a common set of best practices for the management of personal data. We must continue to be committed to GDPR compliance for all future regulations, especially with regards to the protection of health data in Europe, as they should not be exposed to extraterritorial laws under any circumstance. It is crucial that we put measures in place to ensure immunity for our European citizens' health data to preserve the highest level of data security in Europe. I am convinced that the implementation of the Gaia-X labels will play an important role in these objectives. Indeed, CISPE is a member of Gaia-X, as you know, and it is essential that these define and adopt labels level can be now implemented. So we need to work on that. This is why I am counting on the commitment of every CISPE members to promote and support those topics. We are here to discuss the future of cloud infrastructure in Europe, as I said, but we must not lose sight of the ultimate goal to ensure that digital innovation benefits first and foremost to all of Europe's citizens, while we can guarantee them their privacy and protecting their data. This requires close collaboration between industries, policymakers, and citizens, of course. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, and thanks for getting everything kicked off. Thanks to our keynote speakers and our keynote speaker on video. My name is Ben Maynard. I'm the Director of Comms for CISPE, and I'm going to introduce the next panel. I do apologize. We've got a pretty packed morning, so we're going to kind of keep going at a pretty good pace until lunchtime. But hopefully there'll be plenty of interest and plenty for debate. So the next panel is talking about can Europe compete in the cloud. We're going to kick off with 3 really interesting pieces of research from 3 different regions. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Professor Frederic Jenny, and Lorenzo Principali and Raquel Garcia, who will present each of their pieces of research one by one, and then we'll join all of us for a little debate at the end of it. So if you'd like to come to the stage, Professor Jenny, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. Before I start on my presentation, just a quick word, quick disclaimer. As some of you know, I also have functions at the OECD and various international organizations. Whatever I'm going to say today has nothing to do with OECD and should not be attributed to OECD. This is a piece of research which was commissioned by CISPE as an academic, which I undertook with Mario Luca, who is sitting over there to the right of me. So it is as a private researcher that I'm here today. I would like to talk about potential market distortions in the cloud infrastructure service market. And some of you may know that we produced a report about 2 years ago, and we are working on the second one. And what I'm going to do today is go briefly over the first one and also the value added of the second one, which is a work in progress. And I will explain what that means in a second. So what I want to talk about are 4 or 5 items. The first, a few things about, seen from the point of view of an economic analysis, some of the striking market characteristics which may lead to be concerned about the possibility of disruptions of competition or distortions of competition. Second, to go into some of the practices that, because of the structure of the market, may lead, in fact, to such distortions of competition. Third, to go over the survey of evidence on problematic behavior that we have undertaken through interviews with a number of users of cloud services. 4, and last, some cost calculation, because the second report that we're working on tries to assess what is the importance of the damage to that potentially distortive practices impose on the community. The last word will be a call for action, because as I said, this is a report which is not yet finished. We're still trying to gather more evidence to make our result even stronger than they are. And I will call on you to try to see whether you would be willing to participate in this study. So let me go to the first point, which are a couple of comments about the characteristics of the market, which from the point of view of competition and from the point of view of economic analysis are particularly interesting. So not only is it the cloud service market, not only is it a rapidly increasing or fast-growing market, but it's also a market where there's been a shift over the last 6 or 7 years, which you can see on this slide, a shift towards more concentration of a few large actors. For example, you can see on the slides that the share of Microsoft, for example, went from 6% in 2015 to 21% in 2021. We have the same development, let's say, for Google, which went from 2% to 7%. This increase in concentration has two features. One of them, aggregate concentration, has increased considerably, and the market, which was where the largest 4 operators represented about 50%, 49% exactly of market share in 2015. They now represent 77%, which by every competition matrix would be a highly concentrated market. Second feature, this concentration was to the benefit of a few firms, which you see on the, with Amazon keeping, going up and down, but keeping pretty much the same share of the market, but a lot of the smaller operators losing market share. Second dimension of the market structure, two things. One of them is that we should distinguish between the infrastructure and what we call in this report the adjacent markets. And the adjacent markets may be operating system, or they may be productivity software. And what is very clear is that some of the largest players also have a very strong position, either in operating system, that would be the case, for example, of Microsoft, or in productivity software. And as you can see on the slide, that would be the case of both Google and Microsoft. So this, of course, raises a number of questions about how competition is going to develop on such a market. Whenever you find those features, large concentration, complementary markets, with some players which are integrated in the sense that they are operating on several markets, whereas others are not integrated, you have a number of questions that come to mind. The first one is the fact that when you have very, very large players who have the benefit of scale, they clearly may have a huge advantage in competition because of their scale and their ability to absorb fixed costs like R&D costs or other fixed costs, and therefore there may be a tendency towards even more concentration as the market develops. The second issue that comes to mind is what is the relationship between the various sub-markets and the extent to which there is a tying of services, which may mean that if a player is, for example, very strong on an adjacent market, he may, through some way of tying with the markets on which he's not so strong, develop his market share on those other markets to the detriment of non-integrated. The third dimension is the fact that there may be, of course, cross-subsidization, particularly if there's dominance on some of the adjacent markets. The extra profit which is made in those adjacent markets can be used to subsidize some of the activity in the markets, for example, the infrastructure market, which is growing rapidly. And finally, quite aside from any practices that may be undertaken by the large player, this is a sector where there are very large switching costs. We've heard about them in the initial presentation of the Director General. And switching costs mean that customers are not going to be very easily able to switch, to move to another supplier. So this is going to add another layer of complexity or another layer of difficulty for competition to actually work in the sector. So let me go into a little bit of detail at the analytical level on the kind of practices that may distort competition that one can think of. And part of this is some of the things that we found in the first report and that we analyzed in the first report, but which was reinforced in the current report. So let me go directly to example. Let's say that a software provider, so the blue software provider here is the integrated firm, both at the level of the software and at the level of the infrastructure, the virtual machine. So he can give both services. And there are some players who are not integrated, but at the level of infrastructure, at the level of the virtual machine, provider B is able to offer services. Now, you would expect that in a competitive environment, customers would be able, I mean, they have, when it comes to the, given the dominant position of the A provider, they would have to use the software of the provider A, but that when it comes to the infrastructure, they would have a choice between A and B, and they could try to run this software on the infrastructure of either one of the two. That means that in such a market, there could be a certain amount of competition, at least at the level of the infrastructure. That is true only if there are no practices which are implemented by the A provider to try to prevent this competition from happening. And that's where we can have what we call the input foreclosure. And that can come in two forms. One of them is on the slide here. Let's say that A ties the two services that it provides and says that my software will be sold together with access to my virtual machine, my infrastructure. In that case, the infrastructure of producer B becomes useless because it cannot get the access to the software of provider A. But there's a second thing that the integrated provider can do. It can just increase the cost for anybody who decides to use the infrastructure of B. Now, we have really good examples of this. One of them is the Microsoft 2019 change to the bring your own license policy, whereby customers had to repurchase their Microsoft software license if they wanted to deploy on third-party infrastructure services. Now, this is typically an application of what I was talking about, with a number of results, of course. The first one is that the independent infrastructure providers had either to lower their own price or to get out of the market because they were not competitive anymore, because anybody who wanted to switch to them had to pay this extra charge, surcharge. Second, it also allowed, or it could have allowed, the integrated provider to increase the price of using his infrastructure, at least up to the point where the increase in price of the infrastructure would reach the price of the repurchasing the licenses. So we have two effects of this. One of them is the possibility of exclusion of independent providers, and the second one is simultaneously a possibility of lower choices for the consumers, but also possibly an increase in price for the consumers of the services. Let me go to customer foreclosure, which is another possibility. So let's say that we have a situation where there is, again, an integrated provider of services, and where the customer relationship management software of producer of supplier A needs the information that is going to be provided on the enterprise resource planning system of the provider A. And let's assume that the provider A has a dominant position or a monopoly on the enterprise resource planning system. Again, we can have the same logic, the fact that by preventing the customer relationship management software of a competitor from accessing the data of the ERP, then producer A, vertically integrated, can in fact block the competition at the level where there is competition. If we had a competitive market, there would be a competitive market at the level of the CRM software, and the consumers could choose which provider they want. That is as long as provider A doesn't prevent alternative software provider, CRM software provider, from getting access to the data that can be found in the ERP software. Now, this, of course, if, and we have the same kind of logic as before, there are two ways to block this for the dominant producer. One of them is to integrate the supply of the services, but the second one is to impose an extra cost on consumers who desire to use the CRM of a competitor. Now, interestingly enough, when you look, this is, I mean, there is kind of an example, which is the SAP indirect access practice, where SAP policy requires a payment of a license surcharge when the data which is generated through the SAP ecosystem is accessed by non-licensed users. Now, this is the type of foreclosure that we were talking about. So what it means is that, in fact, increase the price of access to its customer base and makes its competitor less competitive than they would be otherwise. So what we see, and this very much came out of the first report, is that not only is there a theoretical reason to be concerned, but one can find practices that seem to match those concerns in reality. Now, let me now go on to what we've done since the first report. So we have interviewed a number of firms, and I will just give you a little details about the interview process. First of all, the firms that we've interviewed tend to be large enterprises with experience of migrating on-premise infrastructure onto the cloud. So people who've been confronted with the situation where they were wondering whether they could make competition work. Second, participants were invited to answer a survey, and this was followed by deep, in-depth interviews with an attempt to get from the respondents qualitative and quantitative elements regarding what they consider to be an abusive practice or distorting practices. And the data collected was then used to try to assess partially some of the costs which were incurred due to those practices, to try to have a notion of what we're talking about. Now, as I said, this is a work in progress. We need more firms to come and talk to us, which is not so easy, mostly because cloud users are often very reluctant to speak. Being an ex-antitrust enforcer, I spent most of my life in a culture where the idea was don't trust the competitors, trust the customers. If you're looking for an anti-competitive practice, the competitors have no interest in revealing it because they benefit from the fact that there's not so much competition, whereas the customers are the ones who are the direct victims of those practices. Well, in this exercise, it turns out that asking the customers does not always lead to the results that one would hope, because they are frequently afraid of retaliation. And I think that what is really important and maybe distinctive in this sector compared to other sectors is the fact that there is necessarily, because of the switching cost, quite aside from the practice, a long-term relationship between the supplier and the customer. And that means that there is always the fear on the part of customers that something may happen if they speak on what they think is abusive or what they think is distortive of competition, that there might be retaliations. And in the course of the interview, we were given a number of examples of practices which seemed, or at least were interpreted as retaliation, whether it was in the licensing conditions or in the checking of the conditions by the supplier to the customer, etc. Now, as a result, there's a certain amount of passivity on the part of customers in these sectors because they are afraid to speak. And this shows into some of the quotes that we found, which are, of course, anonymous, but to give you a sense of what the feeling was, one quote, "We're dealing with a market that is very close to what we have in organized crime scenes, to the point where you're risking your career if you say something." I mean, that's fairly extreme, I agree, but it does reflect an anxiety on the part of customers about what could happen if they complained about anything. Some of the other quotes are clearly there's a pricing distortion whenever there's any attempt to try to use the infrastructure of a competitor, and either we have a system which is designed to prevent that, or if it doesn't block it completely, then there's a price to pay for doing that. Now, those conditions, of course, lead to suspect that, in fact, things are not as good as they could be in the sector from the point of view of competition. When one goes into more deeper analysis of what the customer are saying, they emphasize two things. One of them, which is really at the heart of the study that we're doing with Mario Luc, is the license portability issue, because this seems to be at the core of much of the, or many of the problems that they find. So here we have some elements that come from those interviews. Microsoft severely limits users' freedom to deploy and virtualize on-premise licenses on externally hosted infrastructure. Respondents highlight that there are no specific technical reasons, so that's a common theme. Many of the customers said there's absolutely no reason for this, no technical reason. Okay. So this is entirely a strategic move on the part of the suppliers of services. We have testimony by firms that said, I considered moving from, let's say, Microsoft to Amazon, and then I gave up because I knew that the cost was going to be very high in terms of repurchasing licenses, etc. And the same kind of things can be observed for SQL server licenses. So there is a general acknowledgement of the fact that having a very strong dominant position on an adjacent market is necessarily or practically necessarily going to lead to reinforcing the position on the infrastructure market, and that the customers are, because of practices, are prevented from making competition work as it could or should in an ideal world. The second dimension of the problem are the migration costs, which are not necessarily the result of strategic behavior, which may be due to technical behavior, but a lot of the firms that have attempted to migrate their infrastructure have called our attention to the fact that it's very costly, and that those costs are not always anticipated, and that this is a natural barrier. The problem, of course, comes when you are on a market where there are natural high migration costs, and on top of that, there may be additional practices to try to prevent any attempt to make competition work. So the next step was to try to assess the value of the costs which were imposed on them. So first we got testimony. For example, in the Microsoft bring your own license policy, the consensus of a number of interviewees were that the cost of repurchasing the licenses was of the order of magnitude of 80 to 100% of the cost of the original licenses. Okay. Some firms, often some users, estimated that the cost to fully migrate their IT infrastructure, where you would have both the cost of the strategic behavior, but also the transaction cost that I was referring to earlier, would be, that varied quite a bit from, of course, as you would expect from the, depending on the size of the firm, but minimum range was 500,000, and several interviewees said that we were talking about several $1 million to try to move to migrate the infrastructure. The choice to deploy Oracle's relational database management system services on third-party clouds leads, according to some of the interviewees, to price distortion, which double the cost of the native Oracle cloud. So we have 100% surcharge for making competition work, which is, of course, going to be a huge difficulty for the competitors. One respondent remarked that they do not know of any single customer that successfully migrated away from SAP's ecosystem. Again, for the same kind of reason. So we have a number of statements of this kind that tends to help us try to assess what the cost of the policies are. Now, we are in the process of doing this. We have done the exercise for one policy, the 2019 change in Microsoft policy on the bring your own license. Just to give you a flavor of what we've been doing, we've been trying to assess the aggregate cost of that policy in 2019, at the time when it was implemented. And for this, we based ourselves on 3 types of data. The average cost of repurchasing a Microsoft Office 365 license, first element. Second, the average number of Office licenses per firm. And third, the number of European firms that deployed Office on non-Microsoft infrastructure in 2019. Now, each one of those figures is itself the result of a number of hypotheses or consideration. If I take the first one, for example, we had to ask ourselves, okay, what license are we talking about? Because the price of licenses go from 1 to 10 for the Microsoft 365. So we took as a baseline the intermediate one, the E3 license, which cost $331. For the average firm size of Office using firms, for the average number of Office licenses per firm, we looked at the average firm size of Office using firms, and we adjusted this average size by the proportion of white-collar workers in the firm to try to estimate at an aggregate level how many licenses were likely to be in that firm. And finally, for the number of European firms that deployed Office on non-Microsoft infrastructure in 2019, we had 4 elements. The number of firms holding Office 365 licenses in the EU, the percentage of cloud users firms in the EU, the share of infrastructure in the entire European cloud market, and finally, the non-Microsoft share of the worldwide infrastructure market. So all those are estimates, of course, and the results in this case are interesting. We're talking of a pure extra cost, which doesn't seem to have any objective justification in terms of service, really. We take the baseline, which is the intermediate license, and the average total cost estimated is of the order of magnitude of $400 million for 2019, which in itself doesn't seem to be that much. But if you compare it to the Microsoft productivity software revenue that same year, which was about $2 billion, means that we're talking about 20% surcharge or increase in their total sales through the application of this practice, which of course did not apply to all the buyers of the license of Microsoft, but was concentrated on a small number of them who got a huge increase of 80 to 100% because they had to repurchase the license. But at the aggregate level, that would come to something like 20%. Now, 20% is interesting because when you think about cartels, which is the worst, I mean, supposedly the worst thing you can do in competition, it's usually considered that really bad cartels tend to increase price between 10 and 20%. Okay? So we are talking about the same order of magnitude. Now, we've got some other estimates there. We used an EU Commission study to which we added some of our findings to try to have a minimum estimate of the cost of, for a firm that possesses about 100 licenses and 200 terabytes of data, of switching from Azure to another cloud provider, and came up with the fact that it would cost at least $143,000, $24,000 of which being the surcharge due to the licenses, plus you have to add some of the switching cost, which may not be factored in the analysis. So we're talking about very substantial amounts. Let me finish by the call to action. I'm going to skip the summary of our findings, hoping that I've been clear previously and that you have pretty much it in mind. But I just want to point out the fact that it is not only that we have exclusionary and exploitative practices, it is that because there is, to the extent that there are practices which restrict unduly competition, that means that there is going to be less innovation in the European cloud infrastructure industry. And there is also a cost, a dynamic cost, which is not counted, but which is very serious because we do know that innovation and dynamic costs are very important. So how can one intervene against this? Well, there are roughly two ways. One of them, of course, is antitrust. And Article 101 and 102 in this case of the EU treaty. And the other one is to think about the extent to which those practices could be covered by the DMA or should be covered by the DMA. And then there's a question about whether or not the Commission should undertake a serious study of the sector to try to decide whether there is a need to write obligations, to impose obligations on gatekeepers. Because what we have here is a typical gatekeeper issue, if we do think that the gatekeeper issue as a content. There are some provisions of the DMA which seem to apply directly to some of the things which have been mentioned. So it's, first of all, cloud providers offer a core platform service, which is something that the DMA is recognizing. Second, it would think that in terms of gatekeeping, you know that there's a definition of gatekeeping, which is both a quantitative and qualitative definition, but it seems that some of the operators at least would qualify as gatekeepers, which would possibly lead to questioning whether those gatekeepers meet two of the standards which are on the right on the slide of the DMA. One of them says that gatekeepers will not be allowed to restrict consumers' choices by preventing them to switch. So the question is, are there some practices there which are designed to prevent people from switching? And second, gatekeepers providing hardware or software using operating systems, we also have to ensure equally effective interoperability. And there are also questions about whether there is any attempt to degrade interoperability whenever a customer wants to switch to an alternative provider. So that could be a way, and probably the best way to use the DMA would be, in fact, to ask the Commission to do an investigation of the sector so that it could have a bespoke regulation after having analyzed, try to come up with obligations that are targeted exactly at the problems that one finds on the cloud infrastructure market. Now, to get there, one has to bring elements to the Commission, to convince the Commission that it is useful. And for this, we need your contributions. We need you to come to us. We absolutely guarantee anonymity. I don't think that anybody, even whether in the first report or since then, has ever been concerned. I mean, there's been concern about this, but it's clear that we're respecting entirely anonymity, and we're making sure that firms cannot be recognized. But having more example and having more assessments from firms would help us focus or have even more solid results, a more convincing result for the Commission. Mario Luca is the one who conducts the interview, and I really encourage you to go to him and offer to answer all questions, because this would be in the interest of the community at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Very in-depth. I'll just hand straight over to Raquel, who will give a view from Spain.
So, well, good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank CISPE for inviting me here today. And it's a pleasure to represent the Spanish Startup Association and to share the panel with Professor Jenny and Lorenzo today. Today, I would like to talk about Nubes. I don't know if we have the slide, maybe? If you click. Here. Yeah, I would like to talk about Nubes. Nubes is a project we launched in 2021, that's 2 years ago, aiming to create a more competitive cloud ecosystem in Spain, a kind of response, precisely what the practice and the situation Professor Jenny just described in his first report, and he just did it right now. But why we are doing this? As you know, cloud technologies plays an important role for the whole startups, because its recent development in Spain has allowed some startups to start providing cloud services, and on the other hand, is the base of all the startups to start working, because thanks to them, this technology enables them to scale and expand their business and at an affordable cost. So it's the base for all of them, and that's why it's that important to have a fair playing field. And that's also why we create, when we create this movement, we elaborate this manifesto with the main 5 principles we create essential to achieve this goal, a more competitive cloud ecosystem in Spain. I'm not gonna go into the detail of all of them because we don't have time, but I would like to at least mention them. We ask for a more accessible clouds, more transparent, more safer and more sustainable, and finally, a more competitive cloud ecosystem. And is this last principle one of the most important one, and the ones we have been working more in the campaign. Under this principle, we ask for a cloud market that boosts the freedom of choice for clients and users through mechanisms that reject anti-competitive practices. And in this case, in the Nubes campaign, we have focused on the role that the public sector has. Cloud technology is an opportunity for public administration to lead the country's digital transformation. However, the mechanisms for public procurement are not yet designed for this technology. The traditional models left the door open for anti-competitive practice. Since we create this movement, we decided to open for every entity that might benefit from the use of the cloud, and with the same concern than us. To date, more than 50 entities has joined the movement, and as well as you can see, they came from a broad range of sectors that in itself shows that the relevance of the cloud technology has reached all the corners of the society. Also, in the frame of this campaign, we published a report, Cloud Ecosystem in Spain, to define what Spain needs in terms of cloud technology and how to avoid the potential anti-competitive practice in the public procurement of cloud services. And I would like to share shortly with you the main conclusion of this report. The first one is the one you see here. Spain is aware of the importance of the cloud for the development of a dynamic digital ecosystem, and the government, as you could hear in the beginning, the director for digitalization has acknowledged this in the different digital strategy. For example, the our plan for the recovery, transformation, and resilience plan, and the digital strategy for 2026. However, Spain is still behind the European benchmark country. We are actually way behind. And according to the results of our report, improving the adoption of cloud services to the European average could lead to creation of up to 300,000 new jobs in Spain by 2030, an additional economic growth of almost 24 million euros, multiplying the cloud industry contribution to GDP 6 times in 2030. Also, one of the third conclusions is that in the Spanish cloud service market, anti-competitive practice are taking place due to the strong links between the cloud services and the adjacent products. And this practice hindered the development of new innovative competitive approach to cloud service provision. And finally, and that's why we need here, especially because we focus the campaign on the public sector, we need the commitment of the public sector to be able to consolidate the cloud technologies, because everything starts with them. And according to the findings of our report, it is estimated that improved procurement practices for cloud services by public administration could increase the market in Spain by more than 1.4 billion euros in turnover by 2030. That's why, thanks to this conclusion, and so to conclude my speech, our campaign has made some proposals for the Spanish government to improve the situation. The first one is that we need to develop a national cloud strategy to promote a competitive cloud system capable of boosting the innovative ecosystem in Spain. Second one is that we need to improve digitalization of our public administration. As we have seen before, we are way behind the main countries in Europe, and there is a long way to improve. And finally, and probably one of the most important for this case, is that we need to adapt the public procurement strategy for cloud services to update this procurement system and avoid practices that prevent competition on a level playing field. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raquel. Lorenzo, thank you.
Please. Thank you. Can you hear me also with this, or it should be closed? Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. Because I'm not sure I can see the data, but I will try. So, first of all, thanks for the invitation, also by my side. I'm basically here to introduce you, to present basically to the results of our research that is related to the impact of unfair software licensing practice in the Italian cloud market. This is a research, here are some data from the context, a research that we conducted in Italy. Basically, we should thank Assintel, that is the National Association for ICT and Digital Companies, because 82 members of this association answered to our question, so they made the results of this research possible. Here you can see, well, first of all, a couple of elements from the context. Italian ICT market is about 34.5 billion was in 2021, and cloud accounted for, if I'm not wrong, the 3.6 billion, so it's a little bit more than 10%. And about 60% of Italian enterprises is with more than 10 employees already use at least one cloud service. So this to give you the context of what we are talking about. So here there are just some statistical data about our sample. So basically, most of them are micro and small companies with less than 50 employees, 82%, and with a turnover that is less than 10 million, so 79%. What we tried to do was to in some way numberizing, so extracting numbers from this software licensing issue. So first of all, we asked them what is the incidence of cloud cost on their total cost. Of course, from these two charts, we can see that cloud infrastructure costs are a bit higher rather than software licenses, but still, because they account for more than 1% of the cost in 65% of the cases, while in 60% of the cases for software licensing, and also in 38% of the cases, they accounted for more than 5% of the total cost of the enterprises we interviewed. Here is the first interesting result. So we basically asked them, have you ever met directly or indirectly, have you ever had contact with these unfair software licensing practices? Well, their answer was quite surprising because 23% of the enterprises said yes. So it's quite a lot, more than what we expected. And on the chart on the left, you can see the results. So basically, 80% of the people who made them said they were looking effect. 31% said they were unclear or changed license term. And 23% were a restriction with respect to the type of hardware or cloud infrastructure on which to use the software, need to purchase a new license. So they are quite similar to the findings from Professor Geny. And restriction on using other software vendors, so exactly what we are talking about. Another important result that came up was the impact on the digitalization, the digital transformation of Italian companies. So we basically asked them, do you think that these unfair software licensing practices can have an impact, a negative impact on the digitalization process of Italian enterprises? For 54% of them said yes. You can see that only 1 in 5 said that these unfair practices don't have any effect on the digitalization process. That is also interesting in our point of view. This is basically the most interesting part. So we also asked them, do you think that the resolution of these unfair practices can have a positive impact on the general turnover of the ICT company in Italy? Well, 55% answer yes. So the application of the 10 principles from the CISPE could lead to a growth that you can see in the graph. So basically, for more than 40% of the companies said that the increase could be more than 3%, so in the total ICT company, Italian company revenues. And again, only 1 in 5 said that they don't see any effect on that side. So basically, what did we do? We did the proportion, we parameterized this number on the population, the total population of Italian ICT companies in proportion to the Ateco codes that are like correspond to NACE codes, let's say, and their market value. So basically, the two interesting findings came up. So the number one is that this phenomenon of unfair practices in the cloud software market could potentially affect up to 11,000 companies, Italian companies. That is actually a lot. And the second one is that the application of this 10 principle promoted by CISPE could lead just in Italy, in the national ICT sector in Italy, to an increase between 1.3 and 1.6 billion euros per year. Of course, this is it's not statistical research, but I mean, parameterizing to the answer we had, to the 82 answer we had, this is the proportion. And you should also consider that this estimate is very conservative because it doesn't take into account nor the perspective effects, nor the spillover effects, because we didn't consider all the other enterprises using cloud, and we didn't consider the public sector. So this is just about ICT market. So just to conclude, we know that in Italy there is a target to reach at least 75% of public administration bodies in using cloud computing services by 2026. So we see that solving these issues on unfair practices has a double direction on public service, as you can see from this target, and on private company as well because of the findings that resulted from our research. So in our view, it's important to solve this issue, probably both at national and international level, in order to, as we said, create a secure and open and competitive cloud market, both in Italy and at European level. Thank you very much.
So thank you to each of you for those presentations. I think everyone agreed a lot of really in-depth data, a lot of fascinating insights. So I'd like to spend just a few minutes now, maybe just to kind of compare notes, as it were, across those, because we've seen different research done in different ways in different markets. Perhaps start with you, Professor Jenny, in terms of what can you see as the commonalities? What are the kind of the distillations that we can take from each of those pieces, and what's their what direction does that send us in our thinking?
Well, I think that there's a lot of consistency between the studies. I gave estimates for one practice among all the practice that we've noticed. We got some more aggregate feeling, but the impression first is that those practices do have even immediately an important effect. The second thing that I wanted to mention is the fact that one of the things that is particularly criticized are the changes in the licensing terms, and this seems to be very aggravating in various countries for the customers. And of course, I mean, there are two views of this. One of them is to say, well, the users of those licenses, they would like to have a stable environment forever, and they are averse to risk, and okay, too bad for them, because this is a changing world. The other one is to realize that once you get into a relationship with a provider of cloud infrastructure, you're married to that person, and therefore you've entered a long-term relationship. And when the basis on which this relationship is altered for the future, it is something that you had not predicted. Had I known, I would not have come. Okay. And I think that there is a particularly a specific relationship because of the long-term relationship that there is between the customers and the suppliers, which makes that some problems which are not problematic in other sectors become problematic because I've committed myself voluntarily or not. And the final comment is that there's a need for either self-regulation or some kind of regulation. But I think that comes out of the idea that the market is not properly functioning because there is no one there monitoring some of the practices that could be problematic and involve huge costs. So whether it was the Director General earlier, or whether it was the CISPE principle, or whether it's bespoke regulation, but it's clear that everybody is sharing this idea that there's a need to have a more solid framework for the relationship between the providers and the customers.
And sort of distilling what you just said, I think that it seems that lock-in is a consistent fear and a consistent experience that coming through from all the pieces of research. I think Lorenzo was picked up as the key concern in Italy. Do you think there are specific elements of the Italian setup that makes that more of a concern, or is it something that was you just seeing through a lens of Italy, which you actually think is probably prevalent everywhere?
I'm not sure, probably it's prevalent everywhere, but I agree with what Professor Genibus said about the marriage. I think the point is about of trust, no? Like the provider and the client, the user need to create a trust. So if I cannot trust my provider, no? If I think, okay, there is something that is not really fair in our relationship, this create a misunderstanding that makes, at least from what came from our interviews, how can I say, less will to take the risk to go into cloud, to adopt cloud in the first round, let's say. And in the second round, what we found is that the main problem is in the second. I mean, this is limiting the number of enterprises adopting cloud because they are not really sure. Not if they ask to some colleague, oh, but what is your experience about this with this? Okay, but then the biggest problem is in the second round. Once you adopt it, you see it's working, but you want to improve and to look for better services or to, I don't know, decrease the prices, no? To look for something that is less expensive, and then you're locked.
Yeah.
So in that sense, yes, I would say it's the main one. But I know data to say that it's the same for the European markets.
And maybe pushing the marriage analogy maybe too far, but thinking in your comment, Raquel, about the need for government action to think about the procurement of cloud in a different way, to kind of set up those marriage vows in a more modern way. Is that something that you've been able to see progress on in the couple of years since you've done the research?
Yeah, since the last year, especially this year, the government is changing their public procurement system for cloud services, and they are making some changes to make it to change, especially from the framework agreement to a more dynamic system that it kind of open this system to the small companies, but still there are a lot of things to do, because still what we have seen, we have experienced, is that the government doesn't acknowledge what kind of anti-competitive practice can be inside of the way it's written, or the way they've written these framework agreements. So yeah, they do have changed some of the things, but still there are a way to improve with them.
And those practices, to kind of drill down on those are the kind of the tying from adjacent markets and making one set of products where there is dominance contingent on the infrastructure that they run on. That is something that you're still seeing in the Spanish sector.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess that leads on back to you, Professor Jenny, in terms of, I mean, you talked about the DMA as being a potential way of solving this. I guess your view, and I'll check with the others, does this need to be done at an EU level, or is this something that can be done at member state levels in terms of actually trying to overturn these practices?
My general answer is that in the digital world, everything has to be done at the global level for the simple reason that digital markets are by definition transnational. But I think it's certainly true. First of all, the instruments are at... Second, we don't want to fragment the European market, so having different kind of regulations at different national levels, I think, would be counterproductive. So my answer is clearly at the EU level, because we have the instruments, because we have the power of investigation, and because we are on a global market.
And to take a principle-based approach to that, I mean, obviously we've got the CISPE 10 principles as a way of doing that. Is that something that you see having legs?
My preference in terms of regulation would be for something that is akin to what the CMA has proposed in the UK, which is not so much a principled approach, but the ability for the Commission to indeed have wide powers of regulation after a careful examination of the nature of the problems. So that's why the idea of having a market study first done in the context of the DMA to be able to tailor the solutions to the problem would seem to me to be the right approach.
Yes. We're going to go to the audience for a couple of questions in a second, but I just want to finish with, we've talked a lot about growth, about the opportunities for public sector to move to the cloud, and indeed the restriction on that happening. But if we, maybe each of you has a little think about, what does this mean for the customers at the end of the day, for customers of cloud services that are provided either by public authorities or by private sector businesses? With this restriction, with this lock-in, with this difficulty moving, what's likely to be the impact on those customers, the end users?
Well, definitely to have a more competitive market. I mean, I think that's the final goal.
Lorenzo?
Can you repeat? Sorry.
Just in terms of thinking, so a lot of the research we've talked about is about the impact on the vendors of cloud services. Obviously, at the end of the day,
customer,
it's customers that pay license fees,
yes,
buy products.
Very close to what I was saying before. In sense, in my opinion, all this process is slowing down the cloud adoption. So this is the problem, and I strongly agree with what Professor Jenny was saying about the need to manage the topic at European level. because in Italy we actually started to manage the topic, because we, in the competition law of the last year, the Article 29, we introduced an amendment trying to solve the issue of the increase of cost for existing services, but it's not really effective, it's not creating a concrete effect, and the impression is that local authorities, even if national authorities, I mean, are a little bit worried to take this one step forward, because when the phenomenon is international, they don't want to, I mean, they would like to move all together, no?
Yeah.
So moving just in a singular way, I think it's not considered very safe. You're afraid to make a mistake. So I agree with the fact that it should be treated at the European level.
So it does sound like a formal investigation is the right way to go.
Absolutely.
So I think there are a couple of roving mics. I don't know if I can see them. If there are any questions from the audience, if you'd like to raise your hand, and we'll get a mic to you. Right down here in the front, please, Velamiro. If you could just introduce yourself. I can see who you are, but they can't. Thank you.
Good morning and thank you. And my name is Francesco, and I'm leading GaiaX. I'm the CEO of GaiaX. So more than a question, it was an observation. I was listening to you, Professor Geny, and to me, and I come from the business, from anybody coming from the business, this is no news, unfortunately, but seeing estimations and calculation is always useful. I have two observations. First of all, looking at the numbers from Italy, and I'm Italian, well, if those are the numbers from Italy, I understand this is just an estimate. Possibly your figures were very conservative in terms of the impact that this phenomenon is causing. But there was an observation from my standpoint. When I look at the numbers, having led businesses, I always think about the revenues. So I saw we are talking about the costs, but these costs used to be, in the last 2 decades, considered operating costs, like, you know, structural cost of a company. But nowadays, this is not the case anymore. So these costs go straight into the production cost. So they impact directly on the top line of the revenues, which leads me to think that we should see the numbers in a different way. Depending on the marginality that they are causing, you can have an impact which is 30, 40, 70, and 80% bigger than that. And that's probably a suggestion, maybe, to look at the numbers in a different perspective, which is going to make numbers much bigger.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions?
If I may just react to this very briefly, on top of what you said, I mean, I completely agree with what you said. This is not what we set out to do. I mean, we first set out to try to see whether one could have a methodology that would allow us to have reasonable conservative estimates for, but you're quite right to point out that it has shifted the cost from fixed cost to variable cost. And we all know that in terms of competition, variable costs are much more important because they are the crucial matrix by which you make competitive decisions. So the significance of those figures, as you say, is even more important because now we're talking about the variable cost as opposed to what were usually in the previous time fixed costs.
Super. No other questions? Yes, sir, one here from Javier.
Well, thank you to the panel. I want to make, I'm not a professional on the cloud services, but I have some curiosity on this. And my, and my question is on the, because I realized on this debate that there is a kind of claim that there is no big enough space to develop and make increase the business models of cloud companies, especially the small and medium-sized companies. So the bigger ones, they are taking almost all the markets. And my question is whether the remaining part of that is which is left to new projects, scalable projects, they are facing some tough competition because either the national rules, they are not flexible enough to scale up the pace of growth on one hand, and on the other hand, the big players, the big cloud service providers, they are taking advantage of this competitive size and the deep pockets which enable them to deploy further value-added services. So at the end of the day, it's very uneven in this competition market. So, and in the short run, and even I would say in the medium run, seems very, very hard to catch up.
Yes.
So what other features you can think out of the box to accelerate this pace, and whether regulation is going to be the panacea, the solution for all these problems, or maybe there are some other kind of business avenues which need to be explored. So I'm very, very probably challenging your panel, but I just wanted to to activate your views and your answers eventually. Thank you.
Raquel, do you want to take that from a startup's point of view in terms of how to compete?
That's exactly the sense of our campaigns of Nubes that is promoted by Startup Association, because we also want to defend that in the market there should be a space for the startup, for the local cloud providers that can also benefit from this market, and especially from the contracts, so that the public administration making that they should count with them, because they have something to say and their relevance. And I think that to point these things on the table of the policymakers is one of the steps we are taking in. And during this year we have several meetings with the Secretary of State for Digitalization in Spain, and the Director General and other policymakers that we consider relevant, and they listen to us, and they realize that there are also a lot of Spanish startups, local providers, cloud providers that has a game in this market and should have a space. And if they close their framework agreement so they cannot compete, they are the ones who are closing the market. So.
And Professor Jenny, do you want to comment on that?
I think that this is a very interesting remark. I think there are two separate issues, but complementary issues. In a situation where we have a structural difficulty due to the past history of the sector, the first one, which is really the preserve of competition law, is to make sure that the dominant firms, whether they're dominant on adjacent market or otherwise, do not use their power to make competition even more difficult. The second one, and which goes directly to what you were saying, is to say, well, maybe what I need in complement to an active competition policy is an industrial policy. And I think that what Raquel was mentioning about using public procurement to try to ensure that access, contestability by the smaller players could be effective is one of the ways in which you have an active industrial policy, which complement the fact that, okay, competition is difficult in this sector, there's nothing I can do about this, I can just ensure that there is not additional strategic practices by the dominant firms, but second, I also want to try to help the smaller firms to grow. For this, I need to help give them opportunities. Public procurement is one of the important tools that I can use for that, by making sure that they will be admitted to submit bids competitively with the bigger players, and that there will be an allocation that will take into consideration the fact that it is important for European industry to develop. So I think that the two approaches are not addressing exactly the same issue, but quite complementary.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to call it to time there, because we've got a lot to get through this morning, and we're already slightly over. So thank you very much to our panel. Thank you for the very insightful and detailed evidence.